The year is
Wind over
1260,
empty
and the
steppe
world is
hooves.
holding its
In
breath.
slow motion,
Across
Mongol
the vast
riders in
expanse of the Eurasian
silhouette.
landmass,
Dust
a
clouds
single
rising,
terrifying
burning
silence has
cities.
fallen.
Montage
It is the
screaming.
silence of submission,
Civilians falling
the
stone
quiet that
walls.
follows the total
Baghdad
annihilation
skyline.
of civilizations.
Flames consume
From the
libraries.
Pacific Ocean to the
Books
gates of
hurled
Europe,
into
the
river
Mongol war
ink,
machine has
bleeding
ground
through
kingdoms,
water blood,
empires, and
mixing
caliphates
with
into
ink.
dust.
Mongol banners
They are the unstoppable
snapping.
force, the scourges
Arrows
of God,
darken
a
the
cavalry
sky
army
map.
that moves with a
Animation
speed and
expanding.
ferocity that
Empire
defies
spreads
comprehension.
across Eurasia,
They
Asia
have
to
just
Europe.
burned Baghdad,
Sweep empty
the intellectual
trade
and
roads.
spiritual capital of the
Refugees
Islamic world,
fleeing silent
leaving the
mosques,
Tigris River
broken
running black with
minarets,
ink from destroyed
smoldering
books
ruins.
and red with the blood
Mongol
of hundreds of
general,
thousands.
close-up, cold
Now,
eyes
the
beneath
dust of their
helmet.
approach is rising in the
Lamella
Levant.
armored
The Mongol
detail
gaze has turned
horses,
toward the last
snorting
bastion of
steam,
resistance in the
endless
Middle East,
cavalry line,
Egypt. To
horizon
the casual
swallowed
observer
by
of the 13th
riders,
century,
thunderous gallop.
the outcome of this
Earth
impending
trembling,
collision seemed
fearful
preordained.
faces, city
The
gates
Mongols did
shut,
not lose
burning
battles.
symbols.
They did not retreat.
Cities
They certainly did not surrender.
kneeling captives,
They were the architects of the largest contiguous land empire in human history, and their military doctrine was built on a foundation of absolute terror and tactical supremacy. But in September of 1260, in a dusty, sun-scorched valley in Galilee, the unstoppable force met an immovable object. It was here, at a place called the Spring of Goliath, that history would pivot on a hinge of geography.
Soldiers,
While historians often laud the bravery of the commanders or the fervor of the troops, the true architect of the Mongol defeat was not a man, but the land itself. It was a masterclass in utilizing topography to neutralize a superior enemy, a victory born from a secret terrain advantage that turned the Mongols' greatest strengths into their fatal weaknesses. To understand why the terrain of this specific valley was so critical, we must first understand the mechanism of the Mongol conquest. The Mongol army was a force of nature designed for the open steppe. Their entire tactical identity was predicated on mobility. A Mongol tumen, a unit of 10,000 riders, functioned like a pack of wolves. They relied on vast open spaces to execute their signature maneuvers. They would spread out in a massive hunting line, enveloping their enemies, raining armor-piercing arrows from composite bows that outranged anything in the west, and then closing the trap. They needed room to maneuver, room to retreat, and most importantly, room to feed their horses. Each Mongol warrior rode with a string of 3 or 4 fresh mounts, meaning an army of 20,000 men brought with it nearly 80,000 horses. This logistical footprint was their engine, but it was also their tether. They required an ocean of grass. As the Mongol commander Kitbuka Noyan pushed his forces south through Syria and into Palestine, he was moving further and further away from the friendly, open grazing lands of the north. He was entering a corridor of rugged hills, dry waters, and limited water sources. This was the first layer of the terrain advantage, a strategic constriction that the defenders of Egypt, the Mamluks, understood intimately. The Mamluks were a unique warrior caste, slave soldiers drawn from the same Kipchak Turkic steppes as the Mongols themselves. They knew how the Mongols fought, because they fought the same way. But unlike the Mongols, the Mamluks had become masters of the complex, broken geography of the Levant. The Mamluk Sultan, Qutuz, realized that he could not defeat the Mongols in a battle of maneuver on an open plain. To do so would be suicide. He needed to dictate the battlefield. He needed a location that would strip the Mongols of their ability to flank, a place that would nullify their numerical superiority and force them into a frontal confrontation. The one thing a light cavalry army despises. He chose the Jezreel Valley, specifically a narrowing point near the ancient spring known as Ain Jalut. The geography of Ain Jalut is deceptive. To the untrained eye, it appears to be a wide valley suitable for cavalry. But Qutuz saw the hidden geometry of the land. The valley is bordered to the south by the steep, imposing slopes of Mount Gilboa and to the north by the Galilean hills. As one moves deeper into the valley, the walls close in. It is a natural funnel. The floor of the valley, watered by the spring, was not the hard-packed earth of the steppe, but softer, broken by streams and marshy patches that could slow a charging horse. Furthermore, the surrounding hills offered something the flat steppe never could: total concealment. Kutuz's
Baybars.
plan was a gamble of
Glances
existential
back,
proportions.
perfect depth
He would use the
reached
terrain to
Kutuz's
orchestrate an
weight
ambush on a
helmet.
massive scale.
On silent
He ordered his
signal
vanguard,
raised helmet
led by
throne
the
battle
brilliant and
cry,
ruthless Baybars,
erupts
to
hills
ride out
awaken.
and meet the Mongols in the valley
Mamluks
floor.
charge downhill.
Baybars was to
War
act as the
cries
bait.
echo drums,
His mission was to
thunder
engage the
cavalry,
Mongols, harass
avalanche
them,
gravity,
and then feign a
unleashed
panicked retreat,
Mongols
drawing the
shocked.
Mongol army deeper
Panic
into the funnel.
flashes, flanks
Meanwhile, the
smashed,
main
armor
Mamluk
collides.
force, tens of thousands of heavy
Imagine
cavalry,
a clash
would remain
of
utterly
titans
silent,
where the fate
hidden
of
in the tree lines and the folds
civilizations
of the hills on
hangs in
either
the
side of the
balance.
valley.
At
This
Ain
utilization
Jalut,
of the high
the
ground for
seemingly
concealment was
unstoppable
the secret
Mongol
terrain
tide
advantage.
met its match.
The Mongols,
Armor
accustomed to spotting
shatters
enemies
and
from miles
horses
away on the
scream as
flat
the
plains,
Mamluk and
were
Mongol
blind to the threat
armies
lurking in the wooded
collide in a
uplands.
brutal symphony
They saw only
of
Baybars
chaos.
and his relatively small
Swords
force.
and maces
Their arrogance,
find
fed
their
by
mark.
decades of
Shields
unbroken victories,
splinter, and the sheer
blinded them to
press
the
of
possibility of a
bodies
trap.
makes bows useless.
They believed the Mamluks were
Just as
terrified,
the
desperate,
Mamluk
and few in
flank
number.
appears to break,
On the morning
Sultan
of the battle, the
Kutuz
sun rose over the
himself
ridges of
charges
Gilboa,
forward,
casting long
his
shadows
banner
across
a
the valley
rallying
floor.
point.
The heat in
This
September in this
isn't
region is
a
oppressive,
retreat.
a physical
It's a
weight that
trap.
presses down on men and
Lured
beasts
uphill,
alike.
the
This too
Mongol
was a
cavalry
calculated element of the
falters
terrain.
on treacherous
The
terrain.
Mamluks,
Their
acclimatized to the
momentum
Egyptian
gone.
and Levantine heat,
They are
waited in the shade of
encircled.
the hills.
Their
The
psychological
Mongols,
dominance
wearing heavy lamellar
broken.
armor and coming
The
from
Mongol
cooler
general
climes,
Kitbuka
were exposed on the
fights
valley
to the
floor,
last,
the sun
but
beating
is
down on them,
captured and
the glare
executed.
reflecting off the
His
limestone and
defiance,
dust.
a
When
final
Baybars
silent
launched his initial
roar.
attack, it was
The
hit and
Mongol
run, a
retreat
classic step
turns
tactic
into
used
a
against its
desperate
inventors.
flight,
He
straight
struck and
into a
pulled back,
marshy
struck
trap.
and pulled back.
What
The Mongol
follows
commander,
is a
Kitbuka,
slaughter.
sensing blood,
This
ordered a
single
general
battle
advance.
shattered
The
the
Mongol
myth
heavy
of Mongol
cavalry, the iron core
invincibility,
of their army, thundered
halting
forward.
their
They
westward
chased Baybars'
expansion
retreating
and
column,
saving
their
worlds of
formation
knowledge
elongating
from
as they pushed
destruction.
deeper into the valley.
Ain
They were
Jalut
moving exactly
wasn't
where
just
Kutuz
a
wanted them,
victory.
into the
It was
narrowest
a
part of the
turning
bottleneck,
point in
where the
history.
slopes of the mountains pressed in
Terrain,
tight.
lesson plains
It was here
versus
that the terrain
valleys,
turned hostile.
heavy cavalry
As the
physics.
Mongols crowded into the confined
Weight
space, their
overwhelms
ability to maneuver
speed,
evaporated.
forest concealment,
They could not spread out to flank
sun-angle
Baybars.
diagram
They could not
logistics,
circle their
map
horses.
grazing,
They were packed
scarcity,
shoulder to shoulder, horse to
exhausted
horse.
ponies,
The
fresh
dust kicked up
Mamluk
by
mounts,
thousands of hooves
strategy
hung in the stagnant
triumphs,
air of the
earth
valley,
as weapon
obscuring
valley,
vision
as
and choking
shield
the
hills,
lungs.
as sword
The ground,
mountains
softened
endure.
by the spring waters,
Rivers
sapped the
remember,
energy of the Mongol
empires
ponies.
fade, geography
Then the
remains.
trap was
Ain
sprung,
Jalut.
at a signal from
Text
Kutuz,
1260,
often cited as the
repeated
casting off
here,
of his
they
helmet
fell,
and a great shout of
silence
O Islam.
again.
The
Wind
hills
through
themselves seemed to come
grass,
alive.
fade to
The
black,
main Mamluk
distant hooves.
army poured down from the wooded
Mongol
slopes of Mount
shadow
Gilboa
fades,
and the Galilean
Mamluk banner
ridges.
waves.
They did not just
Civilization
attack,
survives.
they enveloped.
Faith
Because the
endures.
Mongols were trapped in the
Knowledge
valley floor,
preserved,
the
world
Mamluks
altered.
crashed into their flanks from the high
History
ground.
pivots.
Gravity was
one
on the side of the
valley,
Egyptians.
one stand terrain.
The momentum of a
Winds,
heavy cavalry
force
charge
fails,
thundering downhill is
lessons remain.
irresistible. The psychological
Satellite
impact
zoom,
of this
Ain
terrain-based
Jalut,
ambush
marker
cannot be
comland.
overstated.
Time passes,
For the first time in
battle
generations,
unseen,
a
yet
Mongol army found
decisive
itself
text
surrounded.
fades,
The
drum,
geography
echo,
that had seemed like a
wind
simple
fades,
passage
Ain
had
Jalut.
become a killing jar.
The
The
valley
Mongols
that
tried to break
stopped
out,
the
to wheel
Mongols'
their horses and
silence
fight back,
final
but the
aerial
narrowness of the
sun
valley meant they were
rises.
tripping over one
Memory
another.
holds,
The Mamluk heavy
legacy
cavalry,
endures.
heavily armored
Map
and wielding
fades,
maces
valley
and
name
swords,
year repeats.
excelled in this kind of close
Wind
quarters,
over empty
claustrophobic
step
brawl.
hooves. In
The
slow
Mongol
motion,
composite
Mongol
bow,
riders
the weapon
in
that had
silhouette.
conquered the world,
Dust
was rendered
clouds
less
rising,
effective
burning
at such
cities,
close range where the
montage
archer could
screaming,
not retreat to fire
civilians
again.
falling stone walls,
Yet,
Baghdad
the Mongols were not
skyline,
easily broken.
flames
They
consume
fought with the
libraries,
ferocity of trapped
books
tigers.
hurled
At
into
one
river
point,
ink,
the sheer
bleeding
violence
through
of their
water blood,
counterattack threatened to
mixing
shatter
with
the
ink,
Mamluk left
Mongol
wing.
banners,
The
snapping.
terrain, which had favored the ambush,
Arrows
now
darken
threatened
the
to become
sky
a
map,
tomb for both
animation
armies as the press of
expanding,
bodies became
empire
suffocating.
spreads across
It was in this
Eurasia,
crucible
Asia
that the knowledge
to
of the
Europe,
land proved
sweep
decisive once
empty
again.
trade roads,
As the Mongol lines began to buckle under the pressure of the ambush,
mosques,
they sought an escape route.
minarets,
But
smoldering
Kutuz
ruins,
had chosen this killing
Mongol
ground because there was no
close-up
easy exit.
cold eyes
To the rear
beneath
was the long
helmets.
march back through the bottleneck.
Lamella
To
armor
the sides were
detail
the steep,
horses,
rocky slopes that were
snorting
difficult
steam,
for horses
endless
to climb under
cavalry line,
duress.
horizon
The Mongols were
swallowed
forced to
by
fight uphill
riders,
against fresh
thunderous
waves
gallop.
of Mamluks descending
Earth
from the
trembling,
heights.
fearful
The topography
faces,
forced
city
the Mongo,
gates shut, burning
LS, to expend
symbols.
triple the energy for every inch
Cities
of ground they tried to take. Furthermore, the local knowledge of the terrain allowed the Mamluks to cut off the retreat paths. They knew where the Wadis cut through the landscape, creating natural barriers that would trap fleeing horsemen. They knew the patches of scrub oak and rocky outcrops where isolated Mongol units could be pinned down and destroyed. The valley of Ain Jalut was not a neutral stage. It was an active participant in the destruction of the invader. We must also consider the terrain in a broader logistical sense. The location of the battle was at the very limit of the Mongol supply lines. By forcing the engagement in Palestine, rather than closer to the Mongol power centers in Syria, the Mamluks ensured that the Mongols were fighting with tired horses. A Mongol pony is a miraculous beast, capable of enduring immense hardship. But even it has limits. The scorched earth policy employed by the Mamluks in the surrounding countryside meant that forage was scarce. By the time Kitbuka's forces reached the spring, their mounts were likely undernourished and exhausted. In contrast, the Mamluks had the resources of the fertile Egyptian delta behind them and had secured supply depots in the coastal cities. The terrain of logistics is just as deadly as the terrain of the battlefield, and here too, the advantage lay with the defenders. As the battle raged into the afternoon, the heat became a torture. The sun, moving across the sky, eventually shone directly into the eyes of the Mongols facing west and south, while the Mamluks had the sun at their backs. This solar alignment, a feature of the landscape's orientation, dazzled the Mongol archers and illuminated them as clear targets for the Mamluk counterfire. The disintegration of the Mongol army was horrific. Realizing the battle was lost, the survivors attempt Ted to flee north towards the town of Bisan. But the Mamluks, anticipating this, used the terrain to pursue effectively. They did not just chase, they herded. They drove the shattered remnants of the Mongol tumen into the marshes and the steep ravines of the Jordan Valley. The terrain that had constricted them in battle now swallowed them in defeat. The heavy mud of the riverbanks trapped the exhausted horses, making them easy prey for the pursuing Mamluks. Kitbuka Noyan, the man who had dreamed of watering his horses in the Nile, was captured and executed. His head was sent to Cairo as proof that the nightmare was over. But the true victor was the strategic insight that turned the geography of the Holy Land into a weapon. The significance of this terrain advantage extends far beyond the tactical victory of a single day. It shattered the myth of Mongol invincibility. For decades, the world had believed that the Mongols were a supernatural punishment, a force that could not be resisted by mortal men. By using the land to defeat them, Kutuz and Baybars proved that the Mongols were men of flesh and blood, subject to the same physical laws and geographical constraints as anyone else. They proved that if you could take away the open steppe, if you could deny them their mobility, the Mongols could be killed. This realization rippled through the world. It halted the Mongol expansion into Africa. Had Ain Jalut been an open plain, had the Mamluks met the Mongols on the flat sands of the Sinai or the rolling dunes of the Delta, the superior numbers and maneuverability of the Mongols likely would have prevailed. Cairo would have burned like Baghdad. The libraries of Egypt would have been ash. The path to North Africa and eventually to Spain from the south would have been open. The entire genetic and cultural trajectory of the Western world would have been irrevocably altered. But the valley held. The hills of Galilee held. The narrow pass, the marshy ground, the punishing sun, and the steep slopes of Mount Gilboa conspired with Mamluk steel to draw a line in the sand. It is worth dwelling on the specific interplay between the Mamluk fighting style and the terrain. The Mamluks were heavy cavalry, armored in mail and lamellar, riding larger, more powerful horses than the Mongol ponies. On the open steppe, this weight is a liability. The lighter, faster Mongols can dance around them, firing arrows until the heavy horses tire. But in the confined space of Ain Jalut, weight became the primary asset. Physics took over. When a heavy object strikes a lighter object in a space where the lighter object cannot move away, the lighter object is crushed. The valley walls acted as the anvil, and the Mamluk heavy cavalry was the hammer. The Mongols were smashed between the two. Moreover, the vegetation of the region played a role often overlooked. The Galilean hills were more heavily forested in the 13th century than they are today. This forest cover was essential for the concealment of the main Mamluk body.
his
A Mongol
banner a
scout looking at a
rallying
bare hill
point.
sees everything.
This
A scout
isn't
looking
a
at a dense
retreat.
oak forest
It's a
sees only
trap.
trees.
Lured
The discipline
uphill,
required for
the
tens of
Mongol
thousands of men and
cavalry
horses to remain
falters on
silent and
treacherous
unseen in that
terrain.
cover for
Their
hours is
momentum
immense.
gone.
But
They
without
are
the forest
encircled.
itself,
Their
the stratagem would have been
psychological
impossible.
dominance broken.
The secret was not just the
The
shape of the
Mongol
land, but the
general
skin of the land,
Kip-Buka
the
fights
trees,
to the
the scrub,
last,
the
but
very
is
texture of the
captured
earth.
and
The
executed.
aftermath of the battle
His
saw a frantic
defiance,
chase
a
through the
final
Levant,
silent
but the decisive
roar.
blow had already been struck.
The Mongol retreat
The Mongols would
turns
return to
into
Syria
a
in later
desperate
years,
flight,
but they would never
straight
again
into
pose
a
the same
marshy
existential
trap.
threat to the
What
Islamic world.
follows is
The
a
psychological
slaughter.
spell was broken.
This
The
single
Mamluks had
battle
established a
shattered
blue
the myth of
print for
Mongol
defeating the steppe
invincibility,
nomads, deny
halting
them
their
space,
westward
force them into
expansion
broken
and
terrain,
saving worlds
utilize
of
the high
knowledge
ground,
from
and
destruction.
strike when their mobility is
Ain
neutralized.
Jalut wasn't
This
just a
victory
victory.
solidified the
It
Mamluk
was a
Sultanate
turning point
as the
in
premier
history.
power in the Middle East for the next 2.5 centuries.
Plains
It
versus
legitimized their rule,
valleys, heavy
the rule of
cavalry
slave kings,
physics.
as the guardians of the faith.
Weight
And all of this
overwhelms
political and
speed,
religious
forest
legitimacy was
concealment,
rooted in the soil of Ain
sun-angle
Jalut.
diagram logistics,
When we analyze
map
military
grazing,
history, we are often
scarcity,
drawn to the technology of the
exhausted
weapons or the
ponies,
charisma of the
fresh
generals.
Mamluk mounts,
We look at the
strategy
composite bow,
triumphs, earth
the
as
Damascus
weapon
steel
valley,
sword,
as
the
shield
inspirational
hills, as
speeches.
sword mountains
But Ain
endure.
Jalut serves as a stark
Rivers
reminder
remember,
that the most
empires
powerful
fade,
weapon in war is
geography
often the earth
remains
itself.
Ain
The
Jalut.
topography is the
Text
game board upon which the
1260
pieces move,
repeated here,
and the player
they
who
fell,
understands the
silence
geometry of that
again.
board controls
Wind
the
through
outcome.
grass,
The
fade
Mongols
to black,
failed because they tried to impose their
hooves.
steppe tactics on a landscape that
Mongol
rejected
shadow
them.
fades,
They ignored the
Mamluk
warnings
banner
of the terrain.
waves,
They
civilization
rode into a throat
survives,
that was waiting to
faith
swallow them.
endures,
The Mamluks
knowledge
succeeded
preserved,
because they
world
listened to the
altered.
land. They understood that the
History
valley could
pivots,
do the work
one
of
valley,
10,000
one
spears.
stand terrain.
They partnered with
Winds,
the geography.
force fails,
In the
lessons
end,
remain.
the secret terrain advantage was a
Satellite
combination
zoom,
of constriction,
Ain Jalut
concealment,
marker calm
and resource
land.
denial.
Time passes,
It was the
battle
narrowing of the
unseen,
valley that
yet
negated the Mongol
decisive
flanking
text
maneuvers.
fades, drum,
It was the
echo,
forest
wind
cover of the hills
fades,
that
Ain
allowed the
Jalut.
element of surprise.
The valley
It was the
that
lack of
stopped
grazing
the
and water
Mongols'
in the approach that
silence
weakened the
final
Mongol
aerial
horses.
sun rises.
And it was the orientation of the valley
Memory
relative to the
holds,
sun
legacy
that blinded the
endures.
invaders at the
Map
critical moment.
fades, valley
As the
name
sun
year
set on that
repeats.
bloody day in 1260,
Imagine a
the
clash of
silence that had gripped
titans
the world
where
was
the
replaced
fate
by a
of
new sound.
civilizations
It was not the
hangs in the
silence of
balance.
submission, but the
At
roe,
Ain Jalut,
are
the
of a survival
seemingly
against the odds.
unstoppable Mongol
The
tide
Jezreel
met
Valley,
its match.
silent witness to millennia
Armor
of conflict,
shatters and
had
horses
hosted one of the
scream
most
as the
significant
Mamluk
battles
and
in human
Mongol
history.
armies
The
collide in a
Mongols had been
brutal
crushed,
symphony of
not just by the
chaos.
Mamluks, but by the valley
Swords
itself.
and maces
The unstoppable
find
wave
their
had
mark.
broken against the
Shields
rocks of
splinter,
Galilee, and the
and
tide
the
of
sheer
history
press
began
of
to
bodies
recede.
makes bows useless.
Even today, standing on the slopes
Just
of Mount
as the
Gilboa looking
Mamluk
down into the
flank
peaceful
appears to
agricultural
break,
lands of the valley,
Sultan
one
Qutuz
can almost hear
himself
the ghostly
charges
echo of that
forward,
collision.
his
One
banner
can see
a
the geometry
rallying
of the
point.
trap. It is a
This
landscape that
isn't
looks
a
benign,
retreat.
yet it holds
It's a
the memory
trap.
of the day it saved
Lured
a civilization.
uphill, the Mongol
terrain was the
cavalry
shield,
falters
and the
on
terrain was the
treacherous
sword.
terrain.
And in the
Their
annals of
momentum
military
gone.
strategy,
They
few
are
examples shine as
encircled.
brightly of
Their
how the secret reading
psychological
of the land can
dominance
topple the
broken.
mightiest of empires.
The Mongol general
The legacy of Ain
Kip-Buka
Jalut is written in the
fights to
maps
the
of the modern
last,
world.
but is
It is a
captured
testament
and
to the fact that
executed.
while armies may
His
conquer
defiance,
nations,
a
it is the
final
mountains, the
silent
rivers,
roar.
and the valleys
The
that
Mongol
ultimately decide the
retreat
fate of
turns
empires.
into a desperate
The Mongols
flight,
conquered the world
straight
until they met
into
a valley that
marshy
would
trap.
not yield.
What
And in that
follows
refusal,
is a
the course of
slaughter.
history was set forever.
This